Type 1 diabetes is a condition that affects 1.45 million people in America. It is an autoimmune disease, which means that it can be diagnosed at any age and there is no cure. Although it is a hard thing to live with, increasingly advanced technology is making it easier on the lives of those who have it. While technology helps these people, insulin is the only true lifesaver. People with diabetes have the right to insulin, and it's the medical industry's responsibility to ensure that those who need insulin have access to it. The manufacturers have many job responsibilities and must find the fine line between making money for the medical industry and people's rights to life-saving medicines. Prior to insulin's discovery, those with diabetes didn't have many options. They were forced to minimize carbohydrate intake and were put on strict diets. They lost weight, and most didn't live more than 3 months after being diagnosed. Although there were many attempts at cures for diabetes, none were helpful, and being diagnosed with diabetes was something that took out much hope from many people's lives. But all of this changed in 1921 when Frederick G. Banting discovered how insulin could be used to help those with the disease. A new light was shined on the lives of those with diabetes, and the drug was rushed to many hospitals to save people before it was too late. Over the next 50 years, insulin was further developed to make it faster acting and easier to produce. At first, insulin was derived from pigs and dogs, but eventually there was a way to have purified human insulin. Although all of this was good, at the same time it was going on, the price of insulin was increasing fast. In 1921, the first vial of insulin was sold for $1. In 1972, insulin cost $9. In 1982, it cost $14. And in 2017, insulin cost an unreasonable $275. Although inflation was partly to blame, those putting the prices on the medicine, the manufacturers, played a larger role. There are 3 main insulin manufacturers: Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi. These make up 99.6% of the insulin market's value and are ultimately in charge of deciding how much to charge for insulin. One of the many reasons that the price of insulin should be lowered is because the medical industry doesn't need all of the money that they're charging. Healthcare revenue in the US totaled $1.27 trillion in 2020. The revenue is the amount of money that a company makes in a year, meaning that the higher the revenue, the more money the company is making. However, only about 2% of this money, $27 billion, comes from the insulin market. Though this is a substantial amount, it is a slim majority that can be lowered. Even if the price of insulin was cut in half, the medical industry would still be making well over $10 billion a year from insulin sales alone. The healthcare industry is already making over $1 trillion, and it continues to increase yearly due to factors such as inflation, meaning that even charging half of the price of insulin, they will still be making more and more every year. As shown on a graph from the Healthcare Cost Institute, in 2019, insulin was 200% of what it has been in 2012. Not only does this show exponential growth in price, but it also shows that prices will only continue to increase if nothing is done about it. When this increase happens, it will only make things harder for those who need insulin to live. Some might argue that insulin production makes a lot of money for the medical industry, and this much is true. Realistically, the industry might be making too much money for what they're selling. As stated by William Herman in the article 100 Years of Insulin, the global insulin market was valued at approximately $21 billion in 2012. Although this is worth a considerable amount of money, it also needs to be considered how much insulin really costs to produce. In truth, human insulin has an estimated production cost of between $2.28 and $3.37 US per 1,000 unit vial. The medical companies can charge up to 5,000 times this amount, making it so a vial of insulin can cost up to $200 or more in some places. People with diabetes that don't have a steady source of income or good medical insurance are going to struggle immensely with balancing these costs with the other necessities. Now we are going to hear from Amy Rubish, a parent of a kid with type 1 diabetes.
I do believe that insulin is a right because ultimately life is a right, and for type 1 diabetics, if they don't have insulin, then they will die. This is jeopardized by how much insulin costs because a lot of times the insulin can be cost prohibitive, and by that I mean you can't afford the insulin. So we have been able to get around that sometimes by having our family endocrinologist write a prescription that covers way more insulin than we need, so that cuts the cost. But I know sometimes every year, kids, especially in their early 20s who don't have health insurance, are trying to ration their insulin, and they die every single year.
In addition to being an expensive drug, insulin can also be very hard to access in certain areas. According to Mary Busicom, in a study of low access to insulin in poor countries, diabetes patients in low and middle income countries lack access to the insulin they need to manage their condition. with only 27% of 108 poor countries registering all the insulins classified as essential medicines, and 22% registering none. There is a significant correlation in the fact that low-income countries struggle more with getting insulin when they need it. Perhaps if insulin was less expensive, these countries wouldn't have as much trouble affording it, and would therefore have a much easier time providing for their citizens. Bisacom also says that even when insulin is available, it may be unaffordable, leaving both children and adults vulnerable to complications such as cardiovascular disease, kidney failure, nerve damage, amputations, vision loss, and death. As stated, a lack of insulin leads to serious long-term effects, which is the problem that many low-income countries are facing. As well as trying to find the insulin that will keep them alive until the next day, they also have to figure out how to pay for it. If there is not enough insulin for all the people who need it, then there is a low supply and a high demand, forcing those with less money to find an alternative. This is nearly impossible, given that there is no alternate remedy to diabetes. These people must try to survive as long as they can in hopes that they can get a new supply of insulin before it's too late. One of the largest reasons that the price of insulin needs to go down is because of the effect it has on those who can't afford to constantly restock on it. At a blood money protest in November of 19 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, people with type 1 diabetes gathered at Sanofi Pharmaceuticals to hold insulin manufacturers accountable for recent insulin rationing deaths. Activists brought wooden gravestones with the names and ages of 6 adults who had died from insulin rationing. Only 6 people were mourned in this ceremony, but according to a study by Naomi Thomas and the CNN Health Department, 1.3 million Americans with diabetes rationed insulin annually, and that's about 16.5% of all people who use insulin. This makes it clear that it is a serious issue that must be addressed. Everyone who needs insulin should have the right to it, no matter how much money they have, and it's the provider's job to make sure that this happens. According to the article, high insulin costs are killing Americans. No one with diabetes should die because they can't afford their insulin. It's a medicine that can be produced for just a few dollars, but manufacturers mark up the price as much as 5,000%. The manufacturers are the ones who are in charge of putting a price on insulin, and it does not need to be as high as they make it to be. However, there is a low chance that this price will go down because the manufacturers are making so much money from what people are paying. Insulin is not an expensive drug to produce, and yet the price is so high because of how much the manufacturers are benefiting from it and how much insulin has changed since its existence in 1921. Now we will hear from someone who knows firsthand what it's like to live with diabetes, Parker Rubish.
On August 25th, 2016, when I was 2, I was diagnosed with diabetes, and every day since then, I have had to rely on insulin to help me stay alive. And a lot of people think that a pump or a Dexcom just does a lot of the work for you, but that's not true because every day I have to count out the amount of carbs and put that in my pump or my Dexcom. And if I don't do that correctly, then I could go very high or very low.
As stated by the Oxford Language Dictionary, a right is a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something. It can be agreed that having insulin is a right because if people are denied it, it is violating their right to life. By lowering insulin prices or providing an alternate way for people who can't afford it at its marked price, the right to insulin will be fulfilled. Insulin prices should be lowered because insulin manufacturers don't need all of the money that they're making off insulin sales. Insulin prices are steadily increasing. It is difficult to get insulin in many places around the world, and there are many people who can't afford insulin. Without insulin, there are many people who would not be able to live their lives to their fullest, and it is imperative that those who need it can have it. Insulin is a right that all with diabetes should have, and it cannot be denied.